Hi guys. One of the things I really believe is that no matter who we are, we all have a story, and I think that no matter who you are, not only do you have a story, but your story is important. It's important to you, and actually, the way I posture myself is that your story is important to me as well. And one of the reasons why stories are important is because they shape us. They give us meaning and purpose. And actually, for some people, their story, the way that they've been shaped through life, the big events, the small events, the people that they've met, their kind of value system, all that kind of stuff, it provides a framework for their mission in life. What their, I suppose that connects to this idea of purpose. So stories that give us meaning and purpose, and for some, it explicitly provides a framework for their mission. It explains why they do what they do, explains the goal that they're aiming for. And for others, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's almost like not only does this story provide a framework to do something, to achieve something, but for others, the story is actually almost the same as the mission. What the story that they have to share is one that they feel compelled to share almost with others. The story is so compelling for them that they want others to hear it. And yes, they want others to understand them and where they're coming from, but it's more than that for some. Stories need to be told, and no matter whether it's our main mission in life or not, people want to share their stories. But for others, it's almost like, no, my story is my mission. And like I want people to understand where I'm coming from and understand a bit about my personality, my background, and yeah, I want you to hear that part of my story. But I want you to hear why I am the way I am now, and why I do what I do, and why I believe what I believe, and what I'm aiming for, and why I'm trying to achieve something. And that's because of this story that I believe. And so they want others. There's this group of people that want others to listen to their story, because it'll make a difference to the person listening to it. Because I care about you, I want you to hear what I have to say. I'm not trying to sell you something, not trying to make you believe anything, but I want to put this out there because I think it could benefit you. And so there's a group of people like that. It could be religious people, it might be non-religious people, it might be something else, it might be some kind of therapy or medicine or a holiday that they went on or whatever. They don't want people to miss out. And I suppose this makes sense to me, hopefully it makes sense to you, but I suppose that something fundamental about stories is that they exist to be told. Our story, what's the point of a story if it's not told in many ways? And our stories, that's true of us as human beings, our stories, but I think it's also true of God's story. I believe, as a Christian, a follower of Jesus, that God has a story. And I think that our story as human beings, it's meant to collide, it's meant to fuse with God's story. Not that when I join my life to God's plans and purpose, when I join my life to God's meaning and purpose, that I lose all sense of my own identity, that I kind of give up being Ken Johnston. No, I think that actually, rather than losing my identity in God's vastness and God's big story, actually my true identity is released when it fuses with God, with God's story. My true story is released. It can be all it's meant to be when it fuses with God's story. That's what I believe anyway. But I think it's powerful, this concept of two stories becoming one. And if what I'm saying is true, then I have an amazing story. And I believe that. I believe it's true. Maybe you disagree, that's okay. But if what I'm saying is true, then I have an amazing story. One where I am in relationship with God who is, according to his story, compassionate and gracious, full of loving kindness and forgiving, and who is on a mission, whose story has a goal of fixing everything that's been broken. My story, me, if you want to know a little bit about me, my story is that I've joined my life to God. I've given my allegiance to King Jesus, and his values are now my values. His people are my people, and his mission is now my mission. So these are kind of the last words of Jesus before ascending into heaven. Let me read them out to you from the Gospel of Matthew, the first book of the New Testament. So Matthew 28 verse 19 and 20 says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age." So, according to Matthew, his account of the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, at the end of Jesus' life, after his resurrection, So he's died, he's been crucified by the Romans, he's died, he's been resurrected from the dead, and just before he ascends into heaven, Jesus gave his followers, his disciples, a mission, and something that they would be working on together. So it's like a mission. It's Jesus' mission, but he's also giving it to his disciples. It's a co-mission. It's a commission, and he invited his followers, who were disciples of him, to also make disciples. And what's a disciple? Basically, a disciple is a student of a teacher, someone who follows and learns. And in this case, what they're following Jesus for, what they're learning from Jesus, is how to be fully human. God's story paints this picture of Jesus as the true human, the prototypical human, the human that we can all be like, that we're all meant to aspire to be like. And being a disciple of Jesus, making disciples of Jesus, going into all the world making disciples of the nations, is effectively teaching people God's story and pointing them towards Jesus, the true human, so that they can be fully human as well. So you might think, well, our context in Australia, that's how do you do that? It's a bit hard, right? So our context in Australia has been described as quite difficult to share Christianity. Australia, multicultural, it's pluralistic, has different kind of sexual ethics. But if you take those kind of key points describing Australian culture, it's actually the same as the early church. The early church, the Roman Empire, was pluralistic, had a wide variety of sexual ethics. And the early church, the followers of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus, going to all the world making disciples of the nations, they also, the ones that Jesus had given his mission to, had given them his commission, they felt a bit like us today in Australia. They didn't have much cultural weight. They didn't have much cultural power, but they gave their allegiance to Jesus as king, as the king of God's kingdom, and they followed him in his mission. They knew God's story and their story coming together, two stories becoming one, and they shared this combination of who they are in God's story and God's story, and they shared it lovingly with their neighbors, often around food. And I think the power of God's story climaxing in Jesus and being carried through into his new creation transforms lives and fixes what's been broken. And that's what happened in the early church. That's why there's Christians today. The power of their story combined with God's story and their story together transformed lives and started to address the brokenness in the world. And perhaps it only seems too hard to reach Australia with its kind of post-Christian culture, because we've forgotten how to be storytellers. And instead, and this is at least true for me, maybe it's not true for you, but when I grew up in the church, I was really trained how to be a salesman, how to sell the idea of Jesus, how to sell the idea of joining a church. And I think a post-Christian culture they don't want to be sold religion. They don't want to be sold church membership. But maybe there's space for some in our culture to listen to a story. So one lesson I've learned, and I kind of regret learning this late in life, is to not stress about trying to make someone a Christian. My job has never been to convert anyone. That's always, theologically, that's the Holy Spirit's job. But so it's not my job to make someone a Christian. And I think even thinking that it's my job, it devalues the other person. It's kind of dehumanizing in a bit. It takes away some of their agency. Instead, I've learnt in my commission to follow Jesus, instead I've learned to be authentically who I am. My name's Ken Johnson. I've learned to be authentically Ken Johnson. That just happens to be because my story is connected to God's story. Two stories have become one. I'm a follower of Jesus. And I will be a witness of who Jesus is in my life. And I'll be a witness of the story of God. And I'll share with those who inquire and want to know more. All the time, I'm going to the shops as Ken Johnson, a follower of Jesus. And if something happens there that requires a follower of Jesus to act a certain way, to say certain things, then I'll do that. I'll go to my university studies and I'll be authentically Ken Johnson, a follower of Jesus. And you know what? I've actually found that in the university, when I've done that, people respect that. People respect me being true to who I am. That's kind of a facet of postmodern culture. I'm allowed to have my story. I'm allowed to be a follower of Jesus. I'm allowed to believe in the story of God. I'm not necessarily welcome to try to convert people, but then again, that's never been my job anyway. My job is to point people to Jesus and to allow the Holy Spirit to do the rest. And I point people to Jesus in my actions and in my words, in the story I tell, and I point people to Jesus through my partnering with the Holy Spirit in things like prayer and believing for them to have an encounter with God through me. So, all that to say, I've learned that being authentically Ken Johnson and telling my story is much different than trying to be a salesperson of becoming a member of a church and trying to convert people. Once again, seeing people give their allegiance to Jesus is the Holy Spirit's job. I found this kind of season in my life, this kind of posture, much more fulfilling, to be a storyteller and not a salesman. And maybe just to bring it back to the end of Matthew 28, that last part of verse 20, Jesus gives them a promise. He gives them his mission. He invites them to partake of it. It's a co-mission, a commission, and he encourages them and says, I am with you. Surely I'm with you to the very end of the age. And I think when we look at this last part of the Gospel of Matthew, we start to see answers to how do you live a life on mission, in whatever culture, maybe even particularly a post-Christian culture that like we have in Australia, which has similarities with the early church. And so how do you answer this question? How do you live a life on mission? How do you effectively tell a story, pointing people to Jesus? And I think that last part of Matthew gives us a key. Jesus' promise to those who follow him in his mission or join him in his co-mission are promised his presence. Jesus will be with them. Part of what God is doing in the world is relational. It's his presence. It's not informational. Yes, Jesus commissions us to teach, but that's always got to be in the context of a story, but it's a story we get to share in the context of relationship. So it's not just, hey, let me download information, let me hire a skywriter or hold up a placard. God can use stuff like that. Let me just hand out information tracks. God can use that. I'm not saying it's not, but I think it's supplementary. I think what's primary about how we live a life of mission is to adopt a posture that's more relational or primarily relational and not informational. Yes, there's teaching. Whatever teaching comes, it's always going to be more effective from a relational context. So, answering this question in light of this relational focus of of Jesus' commission, of what Christians might call the Great Commission. How do you live a life on mission? I think you live a life on mission by being sensitive to where others are in their journey, and discerning what sharing God's story might look like in each moment. So there's no easy flow charts to follow, no easy step diagrams to go through. I think it is actually living life sensitive to the Spirit, but looking for opportunities to be authentically ourselves as followers of Jesus. It could be a simple act of blessing, fixing what's been broken, or clarifying for people who Jesus is and what his heart is for them. I think living a life on mission involves going on this journey, building relationships, spending time with people, allowing space, but also being around others who are also on mission and doing the same thing and learning from them and knowing that God does want us to be fruitful. He has called us to multiply. It's what he's made us for. It's a real part of being human. I think we can be encouraged that his Holy Spirit is at work already all around us and maybe in surprising places. And what we're doing is we're partnering with Jesus on his mission to fix everything that's been broken. So that's what I think anyway about what it means to live a life as a Christian in mission, as someone who is connected to God's story. My story's been connected to God's story, and it's a story that I feel like I need to share, but it's not a story I feel like I'm trying to sell to people. It's just a story I'm trying to share as I'm being who I am. You want to get to know me? You don't have to if you don't want to, but if you want to get to know me, this is part of my story. I'm not going to force it on you, and we'll be friends. If you never believe it, that's fine. It's not my job to make you believe this, but it's my job to be authentic to who I am and to live out the story that I've been called to live out. And so anyway, those are my thoughts. Maybe you agree or disagree, but I've got some questions that will hopefully provoke some discussion. First set of questions. What difference do you think it makes to see this concept of mission as storytelling instead of salesmanship? When have you seen someone share God's story in a way that's felt real and respectful? Maybe it wasn't like the whole big presentation. Maybe it was little snippets here and there. Maybe it was someone sharing about who Jesus is and just pointing people to Jesus. And what made it effective for you? If someone asked you about your faith journey, what part of your story would you share first and why? Some other questions. What have been some of the highlights of your story so far? Like for you as an individual, your life. And this applies to whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian. But what have been some of the highlights of your story so far? Who have been some of the key people in your life? What about for each 5 or 10 year period of your life? What have been the highlights and what have been some of the key people that you've met? Some of the key kind of life moments. And if you do that, if you sit down and do that, and if you think about it, and maybe you won't have time to do it right now, but just kind of sowing the seed and we can start this journey, you're actually developing what people call a life map. This is my life over these 5 year increments from 0 to 5, from 5 to 10, from 10 to 15, from 15 to 25, 25 to 35. These were the key people in my life. These were the key events in my life. These are the key things that I learned and the decisions that I made, key decisions that I made. And you can start to develop what is called a life map. It gives you an idea of your story. And maybe if you are a Christian, you can look at that and see God's hand in it. And it's a way of thinking about your life story, which maybe someone might want to hear about one day. Finally, how does your story change when you see it as part of God's story? Maybe you have a life map, maybe you don't. But you look at it and you go, okay, that is part of God's story. Or what would change if it was part of God's story? Maybe you don't believe it is, but let's say it was part of this bigger story. What would change? But how does your story change when you see it as part of God's story? And what does it mean do you think, when I use this idea of our identity is released, it's fulfilled, reaches its potential, rather than being lost when it's kind of connected with, fused with God's bigger story? Anyway, those are some thoughts that I have to leave. That kind of concludes this series that we've been doing on this idea of two stories becoming one. But I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear some of your feedback. Thanks, guys.